"You'll never find a husband." I teased, and she replied, "Then why not marry you?" Hey, my name is Henry Doyle. I'm 33 years old, and I fix clocks for a living in a narrow shop on Bell Street in Coudersport, Pennsylvania. It's a small town. The kind where the same 11 people wave at you on the same 11 mornings, and the hardware store still closes at noon on Saturdays for no reason anybody can explain. My shop is 1 door wide and 3 rooms deep, with a window so old the glass has started to sag at the bottom, and a brass bell over the door that my father hung there before I was born. The sign outside just says Doyle. Repairs. People know what we repair. We've been repairing it for 60 years. I wake up at 6. I make coffee in a pot that's older than I am. I walk the 3 blocks to the shop, and I unlock it before the streetlights have finished going off. I wind the regulator clock on the back wall first, the way my father taught me, because a clockmaker whose own clock has stopped has no business charging anyone. Then, I sit at the bench. I take whatever's waiting in the wooden tray, a wristwatch that won't keep time, a Mantel clock that chimes 13, a music box that's forgotten its tune, and I take it apart, and I find what's wrong, and I make it right. At the end of the day, I sweep brass dust into a little pile. I lock the door. I walk home. I heat up whatever's in the fridge, and I fall asleep in a chair with a clock magazine open on my chest. The phone doesn't ring much after 7. I've stopped expecting it to. There's a thing I tell customers, because they almost always say the same thing when they bring something in. They set the clock on my counter, sad about it, and they say, "I think it's broken." And I tell them what my father told me. A stopped clock isn't usually broken. Most of the time it's just been wound past its limit and then left alone too long, and the oil's gone dry and the springs have forgotten how to give. You don't fix a thing like that by force. You clean it. You free what's seized. You give it back the conditions it needs, and then you wait. And 9 times out of 10, it remembers how to run. I'm good at this. I'm better at this than I am at almost anything else, which is maybe the whole problem. My father died 4 years ago. He had a heart attack at this same bench on a Tuesday afternoon with a loop still screwed into his eye, and the man whose watch he'd been fixing didn't find out for 3 days. I kept the shop. I never really decided to. I just came in the next morning and wound the regulator, and there was work in the tray. So I sat down and did it, and I've sat down and done it every morning since. There was a woman, once Diane. We were together almost 3 years, and I had the ring in a drawer at the shop for the last 8 months of it, in a little box behind the box of mainsprings, and I kept telling myself I was waiting for the right evening. I was a patient man. I believed patience was a kind of wisdom. She believed it was something else. And one October, she packed her car and told me, standing in my doorway with the engine running, that she'd spent 3 years waiting for a man who fixed everyone's time, but never once wound his own. Then she drove to Pittsburgh, and I never saw her again. I told myself I was fine. I told myself I just hadn't been ready. I was very good at telling myself things. That was the shape of my life, and I'd made my peace with the shape of it, the way you make peace with a limp. And then on a gray Thursday in the middle of March, the brass bell over my door rang, and a woman came in out of the cold, carrying a clock against her chest, like it was the only thing left in the world that belonged to her. She was maybe 28. Her dark hair had come loose from whatever she tied it back with that morning, and hung damp around her face from the rain. She had on a man's flannel coat 3 sizes too big, the cuffs rolled twice, and her hands where they gripped the clock were red from the cold and not quite steady. Her eyes were dry, but they were the specific kind of dry that costs effort. The kind where someone has decided they are finished crying and is holding the line by sheer will. She didn't say hello. She set the clock down on my counter, very carefully, like she was afraid of how it would land, and she said, "It stopped. I need it to not be stopped." It was a German Mantel clock, walnut case, maybe 70 years old. A good movement under all the neglect. The hands had frozen at 4:20. I almost told her no. I want to be honest about that. It was late in the day, and that movement was going to be hours of work for not much money, and there's a particular weariness that comes over you when a stranger walks in already breaking and you can feel that whatever's wrong with the clock is the smallest part of what's wrong. I had my own quiet to get back to. I didn't have the energy to be careful with anybody that afternoon. I opened my mouth to tell her to try the place over in Wellsboro, but she hadn't taken her hand off the case. Even after she set it down, her fingers stayed spread across the top of it, and she was looking at it instead of at me, and I understood that she wasn't going to be able to let go of it until somebody promised her it could be saved. So I didn't tell her no. 4:20, I said instead. That when it stopped? She looked up at me then. How did you know it stopped at a time that meant something? They don't usually, I said. Mostly they stop whenever the spring runs down. But you carried it 3 blocks in the rain without a bag. So it stopped at a time you remember. She was quiet for a second. My grandmother died at 4:20 in the morning, she said. 3 weeks ago. In the house, in her bed. The clock's on the mantel in that same room, and it was running when I went to sleep, and it was stopped when I woke up. She said it flat, the way you report something you've already decided not to feel in front of strangers. I know that's not how clocks work. I know it didn't stop because she did. I'm an adult. I need it running again. That's all. Can you do it or not? I can do it, I said. That was Nora. Nora Quinn. She'd grown up in that house with her grandmother, gone away to the city at 18 the way everyone does, and come back the previous fall when the old woman got sick, and stayed through the winter, and through the dying, and through the part after the dying, which is the part nobody warns you about. The house was hers now. The clock was hers now. And she'd come to me because she'd asked at the hardware store who fixed clocks in this town, and the answer, the way it's been the answer for 60 years, was Doyle. I told her it would take a week, maybe 2, because that movement needed a full cleaning and the oil in it had turned to varnish. She asked how much. I told her, and I watched her do the math behind her eyes, the math of someone counting what's left. And I knew before she nodded that it was more than she'd hoped, and she was going to find it anyway. She gave me a deposit in cash, mostly small bills, and she wrote her name and number on the back of one of my own business cards in handwriting that was small and very neat, and then she left. And the shop felt strange with her gone, the way a room feels when a window's been opened and then shut. She came back 4 days later, which was early. I hadn't finished. The movement was in the ultrasonic cleaner in pieces, and the case was sitting empty on the bench. And when she saw it gutted like that, the works laid out on a felt cloth in 40 parts, she went very still in the doorway. It's supposed to look like that, I said. That's how you fix it. You take it all the way apart first. That seems like a lot of faith, she said. Trusting it'll go back together. It always goes back together. The trick is putting it back the way it was, not the way you think it should be. I pointed at a stool by the bench. You can sit if you want. I'm doing the escapement. It's the interesting part. I don't know why I said it. I don't usually let people behind the counter. But she sat, and she watched me set the escapement, which is the little catch and release at the heart of every mechanical clock, the part that lets the energy out one tooth at a time instead of all at once. I explained it without meaning to give a lecture. A clock's spring wants to spend everything in one instant, I told her. The whole mechanism exists to stop it from doing that. To make it give what it has slowly enough to be useful. So the whole point of a clock, she said, is something fighting the urge to fall apart all at once. I looked up at her. She was watching the bench, not me, with that dry, holding the line look, and I understood she wasn't really talking about the clock. I didn't say anything. I just went back to work, and she sat, and after a while she said, in a completely different voice, "My grandmother used to count the chimes out loud." Half asleep. Even when she knew what time it was, she said it was so the night knew somebody was listening. Then she got embarrassed at herself for saying it, and stood up and said she'd come back when it was done. But she didn't wait until it was done. She came back the next day, and the day after, and pretty soon it was just a thing that happened. Nora coming into the shop in the late afternoon, sitting on the stool by the bench, not always saying much. She'd bring 2 coffees from the diner sometimes. I'd let her hand me parts. She had good hands, careful and quick, and an eye that caught things, and one afternoon she watched me struggle for 10 minutes, with a wristwatch I was reassembling, and then said, mild as anything, the little gold piece. You put it in upside down. The bevel goes the other way. And she was right. She'd watched me do 6 of them, and she'd learned which way the bevel went. And she was right. And she didn't make a thing of being right, which is rarer than being right. That was the first time I caught myself looking at her too long. She was prickly. I want to be clear that she was not a soft person who needed a soft place to land. She had opinions about everything, and she gave them whether you wanted them or not. She told me my shop's filing system was an insult to the concept of filing. She told me my coffee was a war crime. One afternoon she picked up the ledger off my desk to move it, and then didn't put it down, and she sat there reading it with an expression that got worse and worse. And finally, she said, "Henry, you have 41 open invoices. Some of these are 2 years old. You fixed Earl Tomlin's grandfather clock in 2023 and you never charged him. Earl's on a fixed income," I said. "Earl drives a new truck." She flipped a page. "You undercharge by about 1/3 on everything, and then you don't collect half of what you do charge. This shop should be making money, and instead it's bleeding, slowly, from 41 small holes, and you can't see it, because you only ever look at one clock at a time." She closed the ledger. "Do you actually want to lose this place? Because you're going to." Nobody had talked to me like that since my father. I should have been angry. Instead, I felt something I didn't have a name for, which was the feeling of being seen by someone who'd bothered to look at the whole of a thing instead of the part of it I showed people. I told her, stiffly, that I'd been running the shop fine for 4 years. She said running it into the ground slowly still counted as running it into the ground. And then, because she was who she was, she didn't just say it and leave. She came back the next morning before she'd even had her own coffee, sat down at my desk with a ledger and a legal pad, and over the next 2 weeks, she rebuilt my entire books from nothing, in that small, neat handwriting, and made me a list of everyone who owed me money, and told me which ones could pay and which ones genuinely couldn't, and made me promise to actually send the bills. She'd done estates, she said. She'd settled her grandmother's whole life down to the last unpaid utility, alone, in 3 weeks, because there'd been nobody else. Numbers on a page didn't scare her anymore. Not after that. When the mantel clock was finished, I didn't tell her right away. I had it running on the bench for 3 days to make sure it would keep time, and those 3 days I kept not mentioning it, because once she had her clock back, I wasn't sure she'd have a reason to come sit on the stool. I'm not proud of that. But on the fourth day, I couldn't justify it anymore. So I told her it was done, and I watched her face do something complicated. Glad and somewhere underneath it, not glad. And I understood she'd had the same thought. She paid me the rest of what she owed, the last of it in quarters from a coffee can, and I almost told her to forget it. And she gave me a look that said, "Don't you dare." So I took the quarters. I wrapped the clock in a moving blanket, and I told her I'd carry it to the house for her, because it was heavy and she'd walked. That's the only reason I gave. It was a true reason, and it was not the whole reason. Her grandmother's house was small and white and at the end of a lane, with a porch that wrapped halfway around and a railing somebody had painted a long time ago. Inside it smelled like an old person's house, that good smell, wood smoke and lavender and dust. And there was a mantel over a fireplace that hadn't been lit in weeks, with a bare rectangle in the dust where the clock had been. I set it back in its rectangle. I wound it. I set the hands to the right time, which was not 4:20, which was 5:45 on an ordinary March evening, and I started the pendulum with one finger. It ticked. It filled the room with ticking the way a clock does, which is a sound you don't notice until it's been gone, and then comes back. Nora stood in the middle of her grandmother's living room, with her arms crossed over the too big flannel coat she still hadn't stopped wearing, and she listened to her grandmother's clock run for the first time in 3 weeks. And she did not cry, because she had clearly decided a long time ago that she was finished with that. But her jaw was tight, and her eyes were too bright, and she said, without looking at me, "Okay, thank you, you can go now," in a voice that meant, if I have to say anything else, I'm going to lose it, and I will not lose it in front of you. So I went. But I stood on her porch for a second before I went down the steps, and through the window I could hear the clock, and I could hear, very quietly, Nora's voice counting along with nothing, the way her grandmother used to, so the night would know somebody was listening. I drove home and I sat in my chair and I did not open a magazine. I understood that I was in trouble. I understood it the way you understand weather coming, before there's anything to see. What I knew about her by then, I knew the way you learn about a person who is careful, in pieces, sideways, never asked for directly. She'd been engaged. She didn't volunteer this. It came out one evening at the shop when a delivery came addressed to N. Hale, and she corrected the driver. Sharply, "Quinn, it's Quinn." And after he left she said, "Not quite to me." It was almost Hale. For about 1.5 years it was going to be Hale. His name was Tristan. He had money. The kind that came from other money, and a plan for her that involved a city and a certain kind of dinner party, and her being decorative and grateful at the edge of it. When her grandmother got sick, Nora had come home to help, and meant to be gone a month, and Tristan had been understanding about it for exactly as long as it was convenient, and then less understanding, and then he had stopped calling, and he had not come to the funeral. He'd sent flowers. Lilies, she said, with a card that had his name printed on it, because he hadn't even written it himself. She'd thrown the lilies in the creek behind the house. She told me all of this in about 4 sentences, flat, the way I'd told her about the clock that stopped at 4:20, and then she changed the subject. And I let her, because I knew the worth of letting someone change the subject. There was a man who came around the shop most afternoons named Roy. He was 71, and he'd worked the railroad his whole life. Conductor and then yardmaster, retired now, a widower. And he brought in his grandfather's railroad watch about once a month, with some imaginary complaint about it, just so he'd have a reason to sit in a warm place and talk to somebody. I knew the watch was fine. He knew I knew. We had an understanding. Railroad watches are made to a standard, a real legal standard, accurate to within a few seconds a week. because 100 years ago 2 trains on the same track with watches that disagreed was how people died. Roy liked to tell me this. Roy liked to tell me a lot of things. One afternoon, after Nora had dropped off coffee and gone, Roy watched the door close behind her, and he said, "Your father, fixed everybody's time in this town for 40 years. I know it. 40 years. And the one clock in his life he never wound was the one that mattered." Roy turned his grandfather's watch over in his old hands. "Your mother left him, Henry. You were too little to remember. She left him because he was always at that bench. There was always one more clock. There's always one more clock." He looked at me, and there was nothing cruel in it. Just an old man saying a true thing because he'd lived long enough to know they don't keep. "I watched you do it with the Diane girl. I'm watching you set up to do it again with this one." A man can spend his whole life giving everybody else's time back to them and run his own all the way down to nothing without ever noticing. Don't do it, that's all. Don't do what your father did. Then he stood up and put the watch he didn't need fixed back in his pocket and went home to his empty house and left me sitting at the bench with my hands not moving. The thing about a warning is you can hear it perfectly clearly and still not act on it. I heard Roy. I agreed with Roy. And then I went right on doing exactly what I'd done with Diane, which was nothing. Slowly, patiently, telling myself there was no rush. Telling myself I'd know the right evening when it came. Nora kept coming. Spring came on. She helped me dig the shop out of its hole, invoice by invoice, until for the first time in 2 years the ledger had black ink in it. She fixed the wobbly leg on my workbench stool without asking. She learned to set an escapement. Badly at first, and then not badly, and the first clock she ever brought back to life on her own. A cheap little carriage clock somebody had nearly thrown out. She sat running on the bench and watched it tick, and got a look on her face that I recognized. Because it was the look I must have had at 12. The first time I made dead brass remember how to move. We had an evening, late April, where we sat on the steps of her grandmother's porch after I'd carried over a chest of drawers she couldn't move alone, and we didn't go inside. And we didn't talk about anything, and the light went down behind the ridge the long, slow way it does in spring. And there was a moment where her shoulder was against my arm, and neither of us moved away from it, and the clock inside the house chimed 7, and we both counted it, under our breath, without deciding to. I knew then. I want to be clear that I knew, sitting on that porch, exactly what I felt and exactly how rare it was. And I knew that the wise thing, the brave thing, the thing Roy had practically begged me to do, was to turn to her right then and say it. I said, I should get the rest of those drawers in before it's dark. And I got up. And I carried in the drawers, and the moment closed like a window, and I told myself there'd be another one. There wasn't, for a while, because that was the week Tristan came. He arrived on a Saturday afternoon in a car that did not belong on Bell Street, German and silver and idling at the curb like it was insulted by the address. He came into my shop because the diner had told him this was where Nora spent her afternoons, and he came in like a man stepping into a place he intended to buy and demolish, looking at my sagging window and my wall of clocks with an expression of patient distaste. He was good-looking in the expensive way, where the money has been spent on him for so long it's become a feature of his face. He had a watch on his wrist that cost more than my truck. You're the clock man, he said. Not a question. Nora's been spending her time here, I'm told. She helps out, I said. He drifted along the counter, looking at the price cards on the repairs in the tray, doing his own kind of math, the kind that ends in how quaint. I've come to take her home. The grief thing, It's gone on long enough. The old woman's been buried a month. There's a life waiting that doesn't involve, he gestured at the whole shop, at me, at the brass dust. This, you should probably tell her that, I said. Not me. I intend to. He smiled. It was a good smile, and it didn't reach anything. Then he noticed me noticing his watch, and he held his wrist out, half a courtesy and half a dare. You'd know, I suppose. What do you think? Top of the line. Swiss, it's running about 2 minutes slow, I said. The smile flickered. That's not possible. It's automatic. It winds itself when I wear it. Only if you wear it, I said. Something like that has to stay against a pulse to keep itself wound. Sits in a drawer, it runs down like anything else. You can buy the finest movement in the world, and it still forgets what time is if nobody ever actually wears it. I don't know why I said the rest. I'd been quiet my whole life, and something about him made me not want to be. A clock doesn't care what it cost. It only cares whether somebody kept it close. He looked at me for a long second, and I think for that second he understood we were not talking about the watch. And then he decided I wasn't worth the trouble of understanding. And the bell rang, because Nora had come in with 2 coffees and stopped dead in the doorway. What happened next happened in my shop, between my wall of clocks, with the regulator ticking behind everyone, and I have gone over it many times since. He turned the smile on her. He told her she looked tired. He told her playing house in a dead woman's cottage was a phase, and everyone understood. But the phase was over, and he'd cleared his weekend to drive up and collect her. And the apartment was exactly as she'd left it, and his mother had been asking. He said all of it warmly, as though he were being generous, as though forgiving her. And then, because she hadn't moved or spoken, he reached for the coffees in her hands, like the matter was settled. And he said the thing that turned the warmth into what it actually was. Come on, Nora, be serious. What's the plan here? You grow old in this nothing town fixing nothing clocks with the help? You were always sentimental. It's not a quality that ages well. I didn't raise my voice. I came around the counter, and I put myself in the space between him and Nora. Not fast, not dramatic, just standing where I could be, and I said, "Take your coffee back out of her hands." He blinked. Excuse me? She didn't say you could take it. I held his eyes, and she didn't say she was going anywhere, so put it down. He laughed, a small disbelieving laugh, and looked past me to her, expecting her to be embarrassed by me, expecting her to smooth it over the way I imagined she'd smoothed 100 things over for him. And that's when Nora set both coffees down on my counter herself, very calmly, and stepped up beside me, not behind me, beside me, and looked at the man she'd almost married. "You didn't come to the funeral," she said. "Nora, you sent lilies, with a printed card." Her voice didn't shake. That was the thing that struck me, the thing I'll remember. It didn't shake at all. She raised me. There was nobody else my entire life. There was just her. And she died holding my hand at 4:20 in the morning, and you couldn't drive 3 hours to stand in a church for 40 minutes. You sent flowers a secretary ordered. She took a breath, the only one. I waited 1.5 years to find out what I was to you. I found out the week she got sick. I'm not sentimental, Tristan. I'm just done pretending I didn't see it. You don't get to decide the rest of my life. You stopped having any say in my life the day you decided a phone call was enough. The shop was very quiet. The regulator ticked. "You're choosing this," he said finally, and his voice had gone thin, the warmth all the way gone now. Just a man who'd driven 3 hours and lost. A shop. A nobody. "Yeah," she said. "I am. Now there's the door. You know it works. You came through it." He stood there another second deciding whether there was any version of the next thing he could say that would land, and there wasn't. And he knew it. And that's the thing about men like that. In public, with the truth said out loud, there's nothing left for them to be. He went. The silver car pulled away from the curb, and Bell Street went back to being Bell Street. Nora was breathing hard, finally, now that it was over. Her hands flat on my counter, and I realized my own heart was going like a hammer, and that under the fear of him there'd been a second, smaller fear running the whole time, that she'd go, that this had all been a season she was spending here. The way the city is a season everyone spends, and the silver car was just the rest of her life arriving to collect her. And it hadn't. She'd stood beside me, and not behind me, and she'd chosen the shop. She'd chosen the nothing town. She'd looked at the whole of 2 lives, and done the math, and chosen this one. I should have said something then too. I had every reason to. I didn't. I was still that man. It was Roy, of all people, who finally moved me, and he didn't even mean to. He'd missed the whole thing, come in 20 minutes after, watched Nora go off to splash water on her face, looked at me standing there like a wound-down clock, and put it together the way old men do. He didn't say anything wise. He just shook his head, slow, and said, "She just stood up to that for you, and you're going to let her drive herself home tonight like it's a Tuesday, aren't you?" And he picked up his grandfather's watch off my counter and left, disgusted with me. And he was right to be. A week passed. A whole week. Where I did nothing. Again, because there'd been a lot of feeling, and I didn't trust myself to do it right, and so I did the patient thing, which by now you understand was the cowardly thing wearing patience's coat. And then, on a Friday evening, Nora came by the shop after I'd closed, because she'd been on a date. The diner ladies had set it up. They decided, watching the 2 of us be idiots all spring, that if I wasn't going to do anything, then somebody should. And they'd sicked a perfectly nice divorced contractor named Dale on her, and she'd gone, mostly to be polite, and it had been a disaster, and she'd come to my shop afterward in a dress I'd never seen her wear, still in it, sitting on her stool by the dark bench telling me about it and laughing, telling me Dale had talked about his boat for 40 minutes and that she'd faked a phone call to escape. And I don't know what got into me. Relief, maybe, that she hadn't liked him. Some thread of that old buried jealousy. I leaned back against the bench, and I said, teasing, gentle, the kind of thing you say to keep from saying the real thing. Keep this up, Nora Quinn, and you'll never find a husband. It just came out. A safe little joke, a way to be close to it without touching it. The same move I'd made my whole life. Make the affection sound like a tease, so you never have to be caught holding it. She got quiet. She looked at me across the dark shop, and the regulator ticked, and she had this expression I couldn't read. And then she said, very steady, looking right at me, "Then why not marry you?" The shop went silent the way a room goes silent when a clock you'd stopped hearing suddenly stops. For a second, I genuinely thought I'd misheard. For a second, I thought it was a joke back, the way mine had been, and I started to laugh, and the laugh died, because she wasn't laughing. She was sitting on the stool in a dress in my dark shop with her chin up and her eyes too bright, holding the line the way she always held the line. And she had just put the truest thing either of us had said, all spring out into the air between us, and she was not going to take it back, and she was not going to fill the silence either. She'd said her piece. She was waiting to see what I was. And I want to tell you I had something ready. I didn't. I had 4 years of nothing, and a ring in a drawer behind the mainsprings that I'd never even moved, and a father who fixed everyone's time but his own, and a woman who'd packed her car in October. And I had every reason to do the patient thing one more time and ruin it, and for one long, terrible second I felt myself reaching for it. Then I didn't. "I'm sorry," I said. My voice came out wrong, low. "Not for. I'm sorry, I just made a joke. I keep doing that. I've done it my whole life. When something matters too much, I make it small, so I don't have to be the one holding it. And then I tell myself I'm being patient. And I'm not. I'm being a coward. I let a woman pack her car once because I was waiting for the right evening, and I've been letting evenings go by with you since the day you carried that clock in here. Because I told myself there was no rush, and the truth is, I've been terrified. Because the last time I let myself want something this much, it left. And I decided it was safer to never wind anything down to the end again. I made myself look at her. You asked me a question. I'm not going to answer it with a joke. I want to marry you. I have wanted to marry you since the night I set your grandmother's clock running and stood on your porch and heard you counting the chimes. I just didn't have the nerve to say it before you did, and that's the most honest thing I've ever told anybody. She was quiet a long moment. Then she got up off the stool and crossed the shop and stood right in front of me, close, the dress and the brass dust and the dark. And she said, "You're so slow, Henry. You're the slowest man I have ever met in my life. I know it. 4 years on a ring in a drawer. You know I found it. I was reorganizing the bench, and I found a ring box behind the mainsprings, and I put it right back, and I've been waiting 3 months for you to be brave enough to be the one." She shook her head, and her eyes spilled over finally, after all that holding the line, and she let them. And she didn't wipe them away. "I didn't ask you to marry me because I needed saving. I settled my own grandmother's whole life by myself in 3 weeks. I stood up to Tristan with my own mouth. I don't need a roof. I have a roof. It's a good roof. I fixed the gutters myself." She put her hand flat on my chest. "I asked because I have spent every afternoon this spring sitting in this shop watching you give the whole town its time back. And I decided I wanted to be the clock you finally win for yourself. That's all. That's the entire reason. I just got tired of waiting for you to figure out you were allowed to." I kissed her. Or she kissed me. I've never been able to settle which. And it doesn't matter, and I think that's the point. It was not careful. After 4 years of careful, it was the opposite of careful. The regulator ticked behind us, and the wall of clocks ticked, none of them quite agreeing on the hour the way they never do, and for once I didn't care that they were out of sync. I just held on to her in the middle of all that imperfect time and let it run. "For the record," she said against my shoulder, "you still owe me an actual proposal. With the ring. The drawer one. I'm not getting engaged in a backwards joke. I have standards. You came back from a date with another man to propose to me in my own shop," I said. "And it worked," she said. So, 6 months later, the shop on Bell Street has a second name on the door. It still says Doyle, my father's letters, but underneath it now there's a smaller line that says Clocks Watches Estates. Because Nora took the part of the business that was bleeding to death and turned it into a second business that isn't. She does the books and the buying and the selling of old timepieces from estates, the way she once settled her grandmother's, and she's better at it in 6 months than I was at the repairs in 20 years. The ledger is black every month now. Earl Tomlin paid his bill. Roy comes in most afternoons still. With his grandfather's watch he doesn't need fixed. And he sits and tells Nora the railroad stories he's run out of telling me. And the day I told him we were getting married, he didn't say anything wise. He just nodded once like a man who'd finally seen a thing set right. And then he asked if there'd be pie at the wedding. There was pie at the wedding. We live in her grandmother's small white house at the end of the lane now. I sold my place. The mantel clock runs in the front room, the same German movement I took apart in 40 pieces, keeping time within a minute a week, which is good for a clock that age, and a thing I'm quietly proud of. I lit the fireplace under it last week for the first time, now that the nights have turned, and the house smelled like wood smoke and old lavender, the way it did the first day I carried that clock home for her. There's a thing that happens at night now that I think is the best thing that has ever happened to me, and it is the smallest thing, which I've learned is how the best things mostly come. The mantel clock chimes the hours all through the dark, and Nora, half asleep beside me, an old habit from a childhood in this same house, counts them out loud under her breath without ever fully waking. 1, 2, 3, so the night knows somebody's listening. And I lie there in the dark and I count them with her, and somewhere around the third or fourth chime her voice trails off into sleep, and I keep going alone, quietly, all the way to the hour. The way you finish winding a clock somebody handed you, gently, until you feel it catch. I spent my whole life believing patience was a kind of wisdom, and that the careful thing and the cowardly thing were opposites, when all along, for me, they had been the same. A stopped clock isn't broken. It's just been wound past its limit, and then left alone too long, until it forgets it was ever meant to run. I told that to strangers across my counter for 30 years, and never once heard myself say it. It took a woman walking in out of the rain with the only thing she had left, and then having the nerve I didn't have, to teach me the rest of it, that some things don't need more time. They need somebody brave enough to wind them, and set them down somewhere warm, and finally, after all that waiting, let them run.